Go right ahead.
Thank you. All right, hello. I'm a third-year medical student, and I'm very honored to get to be here and speak to you all today. All right, all right, so I'd love to hear the last question that was asked, because that's kind of what we're transitioning to talk about now.
Get closer to the microphone.
Oh, okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
So,
Closer to the microphone.
sorry. Although not a new phenomenon in other areas of science, preprint use has been relatively limited in medicine prior to 2020, just as we've been talking about with these last two presentations. And as we said, the COVID-19 pandemic really changed that. As can be seen in these graphs from a paper published last year, looking at the use of looking at the use of preprints during COVID, the pandemic dramatically increased the use of preprints in medicine. So the top graph shows cases and deaths from COVID-19 during the year 2020. The graph below, following the same timeline, shows COVID-related journal publications in purple with COVID-related preprints in green. As you can see, as the year progressed, preprints steadily grew to form a larger and larger portion of the body of COVID research. A separate study also determined that from February to June of 2020, 73% of submissions to medRxiv were about COVID-19. With this significant increase in preprint utilization, it is more important than ever for us to consider the trade-offs that come with preprints. While preprint utilization circumvents the peer review process, and I think that the implications of this concession have still not yet been fully explored. I like to hope that people here will agree with me that peer review adds value. We wanted to contribute to the growing body of research evaluating preprints by comparing public and scientific engagement between preprints and their peer-reviewed publications. We looked at three specific forms of engagement: media attention, Twitter citations, and Twitter mentions, and citations. All right, so our study was a cross-sectional analysis comparing preprints and their corresponding publications. Eligible preprints for this study had to meet several criteria. They had to be clinical trials that were focused on prevention or treatment of COVID-19. They had to be uploaded to an open access preprint server during 2020, and they had to be indexed by the NIH's iSearch COVID-19 portfolio. After our initial preprint search, corresponding peer-reviewed publications were identified by two investigators, including one medical librarian, who independently searched Embase, Google Scholar, and Medline. Final search for a publication occurred at a minimum of 14 months after posting of the preprint. So to identify media and Twitter interactions, we used Altmetric data. All media and Twitter references within 3 months of posting of an article were collected for both preprints and peer-reviewed manuscripts. Citation data was obtained using Web of Science. And then finally, linear regression was used to examine the relationships between study characteristics and manuscript attention. All right, so of the 22,615 preprints screened, 145 were eligible for our study. We found peer-reviewed manuscripts matching 118, or about 80% of our preprints. So trial characteristics were collected, and you can see those here. Most of note are that the majority of trials evaluated drugs. About half of the trials were conducted in Asia, with a quarter in Europe and another quarter spread across the rest of the globe. Most of the trials were in early phase, and interestingly, only about half were prospectively registered.
Yeah, it's happened to everybody, don't worry.
All right, on to our results. So this graph is broken down into the 3 areas of engagement that we looked at. Again, that's media engagement, Twitter mentions, and citations. So the blue bars are the number of preprints that received more attention than their corresponding preprints. Red is equal attention. And the yellow bars are the number of preprints that received less attention. So just to summarize these results, in about 2/3 of studies, preprints received the same or more media attention than their peer-reviewed publications. Almost half of preprints received more Twitter engagement than corresponding publications. And just over a quarter of preprints received equal or more citations than their publications. All right, here's another way to visualize our results. This graph shows the total altmetric score on the x-axis with preprints on the left in orange and publications on the right in blue. As you can see, both preprints and publications received massive amounts of attention. Actually, some of this altmetric data is in the highest ever recorded for studies. When we look at the inset box on the right and look at trials that received the least amount of attention, even these had altmetric scores, many of them had altmetric scores greater than 50, which still represents a significant amount of engagement. Now, when we look at the handful of papers that had an enormous amount of attention, altmetric scores greater than 200, generally, the scores for publications were higher than for those of preprints. However, again, when we look at the inset box at studies that didn't generate quite as much interest, you note that preprints outpace the publications in many instances. All right, this graph compares total citation scores for preprints and publications. Again, preprints are on the left in orange, publications are on the right in blue. Now, this graph stands in contrast to the prior, with preprints consistently receiving less citations than their corresponding publications. Regardless of where you are on the axis, preprints were cited far less than publications. All right, finally, we use linear regression to examine association between manuscript attention and study characteristics. This table shows the resulting unstandardized regression coefficients and their 95% confidence intervals. And shaded boxes represent results that are statistically significant. Okay, I know this is a busy slide, so I'm going to point out a few important patterns we noticed. Study size in particular was associated with increased levels of attention, being significant in 5 out of our 6 attention parameters. Government funding was also significant for 3 out of the 6, and unsurprisingly, so was statistical significance. However, what was surprising and perhaps most striking was that our study did not show that an increased risk or a lowered risk of bias was associated with increased attention. Our markers of a lowered risk of bias, such as double blinding, prospective registration, and randomization, had little association with increased attention, both in preprints and publications. And in fact, as you can see, prospective registration was negatively associated with the amount of attention received. All right, I wanted to identify several limitations in our study. First, a single investigator did the initial eligibility screening due to resource limitations, and thus it is possible that several preprints were missed in this process. Second, some peer-reviewed publications included additional or altered data from their preprints, such as when additional patients were performed or additional patients were enrolled or further analyses were performed. This could have led to changes in sample size and results, and thus could have altered the amount of attention received. However, I will note that theoretically, this should have increased the attention to our publications, and thus this may actually emphasize that our results are conservative. Finally, the context under which this research was performed, COVID-19, is unusual, and thus it is possible that different patterns may be observed under conditions other than a pandemic. All right, to conclude, we found that while peer-reviewed publications overall had more media, Twitter, and citation activity than their preprints, It was surprisingly common for preprints to receive more attention, particularly in the media and on Twitter. Further, measures of trial reliability and quality, such as double blinding, randomization, and prospective registration, were generally not associated with increases in attention metrics. Right, thank you so much. I'd be
Thank
happy
you,
to take
Emily.
any questions.
Thank you, Emily. Great. So we've got the last minutes before lunch for questions, and there they are queuing up. Good. Wait a minute. Sorry.
Oh, I'm Xiaoting Shi. I'm from Yale School of Public Health. Nice job. So I have a more like a clarifying question. Maybe I missed this, but since there are a lot of high-profile retracted publications or withdrawn preprints about COVID, especially in the early pandemic. So I'm just curious, did you exclude the preprints that were withdrawn or publication that were retracted, since I saw the analysis you've done is in 2020?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did not. And in fact, one of the trials that we included was the ivermectin trial that was discussed earlier today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ivan?
Right, shouting sort of stole a little bit my thunder, but Ivan Aransky from Retraction Watch. Really interesting, a lot to chew on. I want to ask two sort of, I guess, very specific questions. One is related to that Xiaoting's question. There was a recent paper in PNAS, which you probably saw, that looked at basically found that retracted papers received more altmetric sort of attention before retraction than other papers did. And so I'm curious, I guess, sort of how you thought about that. The second question is, I assume you didn't look at whether or not a particular paper, the published version, had been press released, because I didn't see that in the, and so I'm just, in terms of that tends to have a pretty large effect on media attention. So
Sure. Yeah, I think your first question is very interesting as to the retractions. I wonder if sometimes these papers that are retracted, maybe with the ivermectin one, can be so dramatic and have such far-reaching implications, perhaps by falsification of data or spin of data by their author, that will lead to an increased amount of attention received. That would just be a thought of mine. And for your second question, we didn't look specifically at whether they had a press release or not, but I agree that that would dramatically increase their attention.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So we'll take a question over there, and then over here, and then over there. Okay, just so that you know.
Hi, Nihar Shah, Carnegie Mellon University. So this is about what you just spoke, that the correlation of things like prospective registration was negative, right, with the engagement. Did you by any chance look at the kind of engagement? For example, if it was not prospectively registered, then maybe people were complaining about it on Twitter, and that's why you saw that no prospective registration, so higher engagement.
That is a great point. Might be interesting for a further study. We didn't look into that specifically, but I really like that idea.
Hi, Puneet Janda, Yale University School of Medicine. Great presentation. I guess I just had a quick question because, I did a presentation on preprints, and one thing that I noticed was that, like, for the preprints that got like press sort of coverage, I wondered, like, how much of that is due to, like, if you're a reader of like an article, you can like click on the link to the preprint and you can just access it freely. And so I guess I wonder, like, how much do you think like the open sort of access of preprints sort of led to their increased media attention?
Yes, I think that's a great point. I've definitely seen a few articles on that. I can't think of any by name, but I've definitely seen interesting papers on that, both for like archive itself, as well as like bioRxiv, not just with medRxiv. And there definitely is speculation that that leads, the open access angle is a big contributor to increased attention, just the ability to reach that paper.
Right.
So yeah, I completely agree. I think that'd be another angle to tackle here.
Hi, Kirsten Patrick, Editor-in-Chief, Canadian Medical Association Journal. That's a great work that you've done. Really interesting. I'm interested in the data on citations, and I seem to recall Harlan Krumholz's talk from last time, he was kind of predicting the demise of journals in a way. And I have heard lots of folks say, medical editors need to be looking for new jobs. That seems to indicate to me that the role of journals is safe and journals still look to be thriving. Would you agree?
Yes, that was how I interpreted that as well. It was encouraging to see the citation numbers.
Over here.
Hi, Steve Woloshin from Dartmouth. Great paper. Just a comment, your paper and the two other ones that preceded it looked at preprints and that were subsequently published. So if we want to understand the potential harm of preprints, we have to think about the ones that aren't published. And I'm just wondering about a look at the altmetric scores and attention and stuff to things that weren't published. Is that something that you have done or plan to do?
Yeah, it's not something that we have done. Obviously, for this one, we wanted to do a cross-sectional analysis, so we kind of needed to have both the preprint and the publication. But I agree, that's something we've discussed before as well, that's important to look at those that are not published. And I think it'd be very useful to consider that in a future study. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you can ask a question? Okay, go right ahead. Last one.
Wolfgang Gersendorf, a friendly neighborhood astrophysicist. So we've had preprints for, as I said, a while, and so our journals did not disappear. But one of the things that I found very interesting, you sort of track separately the preprint citations as well as the journal citations. And so in our field, and it would be interesting for you to comment, we just merged those. So as our preprints go up on, first you cite the preprint archive number. And then in future years, you just cite the things. But I mean, we have aggregators like the NASA Astrophysical Data System that just merges these citations and it's sort of indistinguishable. And I'm wondering which aggregators do you use for citation tracking? And could they do that as well?
Yeah, we used Web of Science for our citation tracking. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think they do still have separate numbers. Those are not combined, but that's a great point.
Is there a specific reason? Do you know why they wanted it?
I'm not sure. It's a great question. If anyone else here knows.
Thank you. Very nice talk.
Thank you.
From online, yeah.
Yeah, Melissa Ruthlifson asks, do you think one aspect of the citation findings for publications versus preprints might be the discoverability of publications, which is good due to Medline, for example, versus the findability of preprints, which is lacking, especially on the preprint servers, the ability to identify, researchers to identify on the different kinds of hosting platforms?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I hadn't actually thought of that. So that's a very interesting point that I would like to add to our future work.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily.